The snow was already up to her knees when she shoved the spade into the dirt and carved a trench alongside the cabin wall. Her belly, round and taut with a child nearly due, pressed painfully against the stiff wool of her coat with each motion. She should have stopped. Anyone else would have. But Clara Tomlinson kept digging, because the cold wasn't letting up, and the night before, her baby had stopped kicking, just for a moment, long enough to send a panic through her chest sharper than any wind, long enough to remind her she wasn't just surviving for herself anymore. She had tried to follow every trick the settlers had offered. Logs stacked thick, mud chinked tight, stones piled high in the hearth and held warm through dusk. She stuffed moss into every gap she could find, packed snow around the foundation, and even slept with a hot rock at her feet. Still the chill crept in, from the floor, from the walls, from the roof, especially the roof, and everyone said the same thing. Cabins breathe, girl. You don't want it too tight. You'll trap moisture, you'll trap smoke, you'll trap death. But Clara didn't care about their rules anymore, because the cold was killing her already. The draft that leaked down from the eaves turned to frost on her blanket. Her teeth had chattered so hard they ached. Her child barely moved most nights, so now she was dragging mud-soaked snow, logs and canvas against the outer walls, forcing the angle of the roof down until it met the frozen ground. The whole cabin looked ridiculous, like it had hunched its shoulders and folded in on itself, more a lump than a house. She braced it with sticks, with ropes. She covered the seams with hide, stuffed them with hay, dragged snow over the gaps, until it all looked like a half-buried beast under a winter pelt. And in town, they mocked her. What's she doing now? Building a hovel for rats? She's making herself a cave. Maybe she thinks the wolves will leave her be if she lives like one. She's lost it, poor thing. That baby's cooked her brain already. But she kept at it, hands numb, back screaming. And when the sky turned black and the next storm rolled in, the one that drove every other settler to stoke their stoves, until the logs turned to ash in hours, to pile every blanket they owned, to press against each other and still feel their breath freeze, Clara lit her single log fire and sat in silence, not sweating, no, but not shivering either, because her cabin held the warmth for the first time, as if the earth had hugged her back. But that part was still days away, for now she was still alone, still doubted, still scraping frozen dirt and clumps of ice with bleeding fingers, too tired to cry, too determined to stop. And as she worked, the wind whispered stories through the pine line behind her, like voices half-remembered. She didn't believe in ghosts, but she'd heard enough to wonder if the land remembered. The women before her, the ones who also couldn't afford to follow the rules, the ones who made strange shapes in the woods, who bent branches in peculiar ways, who turned roofs into blankets and cabins into caves, and were called mad until their babies lived. Her husband hadn't been buried long, 3 months maybe. The ground was hard then, and she'd had to do most of it herself. Pneumonia, they said. You stayed out too long, they told him. Next time, don't let the snow catch you. But there was no next time, just a horse that wandered back riderless, and a bundle on its saddle containing a rusted hatchet and a final note with a list of supplies he never got to buy. That night she'd stared at the ceiling, counting every plank, every crack between the beams. And that was the first time she saw it, how the heat always rose, how the frost hung in jagged lines along the slope of the roof. And she knew then the roof wasn't just letting the cold in, it was letting the warmth out. It was bleeding her dry, plank by plank. It wasn't a theory, it was a feeling, like knowing your child's breath by sound, or the way the floor creaked when someone unwanted stepped near. And now, every time she crawled outside to work on her haphazard slope, adding more hides, dragging more snow, adjusting angles, she wasn't just defying the town's ridicule, she was trying to seal up a wound, stop the bleeding, save a life that hadn't even begun crying yet. But the mockery grew. One morning a pair of neighbor boys came riding past on mules. They slowed when they saw her hunched over her log supports, her dress caked in mud, hands purple from the cold. One leaned in toward the other and laughed, loud enough for her to hear. She's making a haystack, not a house. She'll have rabbits nesting in that thing by spring. She didn't answer. She didn't even look, because answering made it real, and she was holding on to something more fragile than reputation now. Hope. Hope that this ridiculous-looking roof, this collapsed tent of wood and snow, would do something no man's fire had managed yet. Keep a child warm. A few days later, Clara woke to a sound she hadn't heard in weeks. Silence. Not wind howling, not branches snapping under snow, just silence. It wasn't peace. It was worse. A deep, pressing quiet that settled in like the sky itself had frozen. Her breath hung like fog in the air, even inside. She touched the wall beside her and felt frost crusted along the interior logs. The fire had gone out, and she hadn't noticed. Panicked, She crawled toward the hearth and saw the coals had died hours before. Her child kicked once, sharp and sudden, like a complaint, but then nothing. She screamed, not aloud, not in voice, but inside. The scream tore through her lungs as she fumbled for flint and steel. Her hands trembled so violently she dropped the spark twice. Then again, her breath grew shallow. The cold closed in around her like a shroud. The scream became tears, and the tears froze on her cheeks before they hit her chin. But somehow, the cold didn't deepen. That was the first time she noticed it. Even with the fire dead and the frost at the seams, the air inside the cabin felt still, insulated, as if the heat from her own body, her own breath, had clung to the air longer than before, as if the roof, ugly, scoffed at, sagging like a beast's back, had held something in. That was the moment she knew it had worked. Not perfectly, not yet, but enough to give her time. She lit the fire on the fourth strike, and when the first orange glow returned, she didn't sob. She exhaled, slow and steady, as if pushing out the last of the fear through her teeth. By the next morning, her cabin was warmer than any other she'd been in since her husband's death. And that was when the knocking began. Not on her door, but on her ideas. Because while they mocked her, while they gossiped and jeered, the storm had grown worse, and their homes had grown colder, and the smoke from their chimneys rose fast and vanished faster. And someone who had laughed, walked by Clara's place at dawn, just to peek, and saw not smoke, but steam, slow, rising, warm steam trailing from the low edges of her roof, where it met the ground like a buried cradle. He paused, watched, blinked, and for the first time didn't say a word. The man who lingered that morning said nothing to Clara. He didn't knock, didn't shout, didn't so much as shift the snow under his boots. He simply stood there, arms crossed, jaw clenched, staring at the strange sloped mass that used to be a recognizable frontier cabin. Then he turned, walked off through the crusted snow, and vanished into the pine ridge. But the next day, 2 others passed by, and then a third. By the end of the week, Clara had seen 8 men ride slowly past her home. Not one of them had the nerve to speak to her, but word had begun to spread, nonetheless. They'd called it foolish, her sloping roof that dropped straight to the dirt and vanished under the weight of canvas, mud, branches, and snow. Her crude outer skirt of logs stacked not upright, but sideways, and nearly buried like animal burrows. They called it a danger, a fire trap, a nesting ground for disease. One settler even joked she'd suffocate herself and the unborn both, that the devil himself would find her cabin too damp to enter. But they weren't laughing now, because that week the storm settled in. Not a blizzard, not a howling terror of white and chaos like some feared. It was worse. It was still and heavy and wrong. Cold that hung like glass in the air. Cold that didn't scream, but waited, sapped, sank its teeth into the marrow. It was the kind of winter that didn't kill with drama. It killed in silence, one by one. At night, Clara heard things, branches snapping that shouldn't have snapped, coyotes howling, strange, drawn-out sounds, and once what she swore was the far-off, faint creak of a wooden wall giving way. Not near, not hers, but close enough. She pressed her hand to the logs that formed her cabin's heart, and they were warm, not hot, but warm enough to feel alive. It made her dizzy, or maybe that was just the baby again, shifting, restless. The floor held heat longer now, the roof too. She had pulled down extra furs and tucked them into the seams of the sloped edges, draped a blanket across the apex beam. Inside it was dark, so dark, but it was a cocoon, and in the dark, Clara slept longer. For the first time in months, she'd woken without pain in her hips. She could sit by the fire without hugging her knees. She could hear her child turning in her womb like a fish in a pond that had finally thawed. She lit fewer logs. She used less water. She didn't cough anymore. And the silence outside, it turned loud with whispers. The midwife came first. Her name was Bess Ryland, a hard-knuckled woman who'd delivered half the town's babies and buried the other half without flinching. She showed up at Clara's door without announcement and knocked like a woman who knew her fists meant authority. Clara opened slowly. She didn't invite her in. "I come to check you're still breathing," Bess said. Clara said nothing. Bess peered behind her, squinting into the dark interior. "Looks like a bear cave in there." "It's warm, I heard." They stood like that for a long while, neither yielding. Then Bess reached into her coat and pulled out a wrapped cloth, some dried mint, some ground bark, and a few pine tips bundled together with a leather thong. "For tea," she said. Clara took it. Bess turned and left without another word. The next evening, a different kind of visitor came. Not a helper, a watcher. Levi Brank, one of the younger men from town, full of jokes, full of pride, known for his big mouth and louder opinions. He circled the cabin like a man scoping out a wild animal's den. again. He kept his distance, but traced the roofline with his eyes, watching how the snow curved seamlessly down to the ground, watched how she'd dug small trenches to direct meltwater away, watched how she'd propped sections up with angled poles and covered exposed beams with hides and branches. Clara stood in the shadows inside, watching him. He never knocked, just stared, then left. But the next morning she heard hammering from down the hill. By the week's end, 4 cabins in the valley had makeshift lean-tos nailed against one side. 2 others had wrapped burlap and rope along their eaves, trying to mimic the seal of her low-hanging roof. One man tried to weight his roofline with sodden canvas, but it collapsed the structure and sent the chimney crashing down through the parlor. Clara didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She just laid in bed that night, one hand over her belly, and stared at the low ceiling, where steam from the hearth rose gently and didn't vanish. She could see the beams sweat with warmth. The child stirred against her ribs, slow and steady, and for the first time she whispered to it, "You're gonna live, little one." She said it like a promise, a prayer, but warmth didn't solve everything, because with heat came attention, and attention meant pride would flare. The churchman arrived on Sunday, Reverend Fletcher, a tall, gaunt man with black eyes and a voice like cracked stone. He didn't knock either. He stood outside until Clara opened the door, face half shaded by his wide-brimmed hat. "You've caused a stir," he said without preamble. Clara didn't reply. "They think you've worked some strange charm, that your place holds heat unnatural." "There's no charm," she said. "Just snow, mud, rope." He frowned. "I've warned folks before about turning from God's designs in favor of tricks. You'd do well not to make yourself the center of attention, Mrs. Tomlinson. There's talk. There's always talk. This kind breeds envy. Envy breeds division." She looked at him square in the eyes. "Then tell them to build warmer cabins." That silenced him for a moment. "I hope you'll be in church this week." She didn't answer. He left without waiting, but what he said lingered. Envy, division. He was right. A family came knocking 3 days later, not out of spite, but desperation. Their baby was sick, the kind of sick that didn't cry anymore, just wheezed. Their roof had split in the cold, and the draft poured in like smoke through a broken chimney. Clara gave them all the moss she had left, showed them how to wrap their walls tighter, told them how to dig a snow barrier to slow the wind. She didn't open her door wide. She couldn't, but she pressed a warmed rock into the father's hand and said, "Sleep with this under the child's feet." He looked at her with eyes full of disbelief. "But the fire's barely enough for a kettle." "You don't need to burn hotter," she whispered. "You need to keep it from running away." And that was the secret. It always had been. Every man out there burned bigger fires, split more logs, heaped more coal, believing the heat had to come from fury. But Clara learned the truth in silence. It wasn't about rage. It was about keeping what you had, like grief, like warmth, like love. A storm came again that night, a real one this time. Roaring, blinding, wind that screamed down the ridge like it had found new lungs. Roofs were torn, trees fell, chimneys cracked, and cabins that once stood proud like monuments to square-jawed stubbornness now hunched in the wind like old dogs whipped with sticks. But Clara's home? It held. It sank deeper into the storm. The snow slid over it. The canvas gripped tight. The angles she'd bent so carefully now caught the wind and bled it away like the hull of a ship riding a wave. She barely fed the fire that night, a single log, and yet her breath didn't cloud in the air. The walls sweated with life, and when the baby kicked, she smiled through the storm, because outside the world was breaking, but inside the buried roof held steady, and they would all remember. By the 3rd week of the freeze, most of the valley had turned quiet in the worst kind of way. There were no more wagon wheels crunching past Clara's cabin, no boys jeering from the ridge, no smoke rising from the chimney tops by mid-morning. The wind still came, still groaned and rattled and swept across the frozen world like a hungry ghost, but the people no longer answered it with defiance. The fight had gone out of them. Clara didn't know how many had left. Some cabins stood empty, shutters flapping loose, doors cracked ajar, tracks in the snow leading nowhere. Others were still occupied, but barely. From the ridge, she could sometimes see the dim flicker of firelight through cracked panes at night, orange glows in a sea of blue frost. But they were weak, flickering, as if the flames themselves were struggling to breathe. And yet inside her own cabin, it was different. Not warm like summer, no, but not deathly either. It was survivable, livable, human. The roof now fully touched the ground. She had dug little paths along the outside to crawl around and check the seams, to reinforce areas where snow had blown off or branches had sagged. From a distance, it looked like a mound, a lumpy beast half swallowed by the earth. But inside it held, inside it embraced. There was something else too, something she hadn't expected. Stillness. Not the stillness of dread like in the early weeks, not the paralysis of waiting for death, but something else. Peace. For the first time since her husband died, Clara felt a quiet that didn't bite, a silence that didn't press like a pillow over the face. She could hear her breath, hear the baby shift, hear the soft creak of logs as they warmed, expanded, and settled into place like a great sleeping spine. She had no clock, but she knew the days by light and by movement within. She slept longer, ate slower. The cold wasn't rushing her anymore. The snow wasn't her jailer. She was in control, and when she stood, she could feel her body healing. Her joints loosened. Her cough was gone. The baby kicked more often, not in panic, but in rhythm. She had bought time, and she knew it. But no miracle goes unnoticed. It began with a knock, not a timid knock, a desperate one. 3 fast raps, a pause, then 2 more. She opened the door slowly, pushing the weighted fur aside, and found a woman on her knees in the snow. Her skin was grey-blue, lips cracked, eyes wide with the look of someone far past shame. "Please," she whispered. "Please, he's not breathing right." Clara didn't ask who. She just pulled the woman inside. They sat by the hearth. The woman's name was Mary Huxley. Her youngest, a boy of 3, had stopped moving 2 nights ago. He breathed, barely, but his skin was mottled with frost. Their firewood was gone. Her husband had been out foraging and hadn't come back. Clara didn't blink. She wrapped stones in wet cloth and laid them by the hearth to steam, poured a thimble of broth from her pot, barely more than bone water, and handed it to Mary. "You'll stay here," she said. "The boy, too. Go get him." Mary broke into tears. I can't carry him back alone." "I'll help." It took them an hour to reach the cabin down the slope. Clara bundled herself in every hide she owned. Mary wrapped a spare quilt around her shoulders and carried a lantern. The wind had lessened, but the cold was worse. The killing kind, where your breath stuck to your lips and your fingers stopped responding halfway to the door. Inside the Huxley cabin, it was like stepping into a tomb. The hearth was out. The baby lay wrapped on a cot with blue lips. Clara didn't ask. She scooped him up, felt the faintest warmth still in the child's chest, and whispered something soft, words she didn't remember, then carried him out like a bundle of coals she refused to let die. Back inside her cabin, she placed the boy near the hearth and began the slow process of waking the blood. Warm stone to his feet, wet cloth on his face. Not too fast, not too much. She'd read it once, somewhere, years ago. You couldn't shock the body back. You had to coax it. He stirred 2 hours later, not with a cry, but a sigh. Mary collapsed beside him and sobbed into the floorboards, her hands trembling like leaves in a windstorm. Clara said nothing. She simply set another log on the fire and curled her legs beneath her. The words spread from there. They came in 2s, then in 3s, families with red noses and hollow cheeks, fathers missing fingers, mothers carrying sick babies bundled in cloth so tight the children couldn't move. They knocked on her door not for charity, but for survival. She didn't turn them away. There was no room, not really, but they made room. She cleared a corner near the far wall, stacked furs, laid rocks beneath, and told them to take turns sleeping. Some only stayed 1 night, long enough to warm bones and catch breath. Others stayed longer. A few brought food in exchange. Salt, nails. One woman brought a loaf of bread she'd saved since fall, now hard as stone. They softened it in steam and passed it around like communion. The fire burned slow, always slow, a single log every few hours, sometimes just coals. The warmth clung. The roof curved low, catching heat and pressing it down like a weighted blanket. The floor no longer seeped. The walls no longer wept. It was working. More than working. It was becoming hope. But nothing good goes unpunished. Reverend Fletcher returned, this time with 2 men. He didn't knock. He stood outside and called for her. "Clara Tomlinson, I'd like a word." Inside, the children stirred. A baby began to cry. Mary moved to hush him, but Clara stood and walked to the door. She opened it just enough to see the whites of the Reverend's eyes. "You've made this place into a shelter," he said flatly. "There are people freezing. There are rules, health, fire risk. You've got a dozen bodies in there packed like kindling. No one else would take them. And you've turned this into a gathering place. That's not how God intended homes to be run." Clara didn't flinch. God didn't intend for people to die in the cold either. "You've built a structure that goes against everything we've known. You think you're wiser than men who've built cabins for generations?" "I think I'm warmer." That landed like a slap. One of the men beside Fletcher, a younger settler named Caleb Doyle, looked down. The other man clenched his jaw. "You'll be held responsible," the Reverend said. "If anyone dies in there." Clara stepped out, belly heavy, breath fogging in the air. "If they hadn't come here, they'd be dead already." Fletcher narrowed his eyes. "You're due soon, aren't you? 2 weeks, maybe. You think it wise to surround yourself with the sick and desperate when you're ready to bear life I think I'm already doing that. That was the last time the Reverend visited. But more came. More families, more coughing, more frostbite. More limbs wrapped in cloth. Clara rationed her warmth like bread. She taught others to build roof skirts with snow, to pack their seams, to dig trenches and line them with rock. Some tried, some failed, some begged to stay. She let them. Her cabin, once mocked, became legend. Not some glowing palace, no, but a shelter. The last night before the baby came, there were 16 people inside, not all sleeping, some curled by the wall, some sitting on crates. One man hadn't spoken in 2 days, just stared at the fire like it held a piece of his soul. That night, Clara felt the contractions, slow at first, then stronger. The women took over. They cleared a space, heated towels, boiled water. Bess Ryland showed up unannounced, brushing past everyone like she owned the walls. She didn't say anything when she saw the inside, but she nodded once. "You built a womb big enough for a town," she whispered. Then she helped deliver Clara's child in the middle of a cabin buried in snow, surrounded by strangers, warmed by a fire no bigger than a loaf of bread. A girl, healthy, pink-cheeked, crying loud enough to echo through the beams. Clara held her and sobbed, not for the pain, not for the miracle, but because she was warm, because they were alive, because her roof, her foolish roof, buried in snow and mud and ridicule, had become the reason her daughter would see spring. And when Bess cleaned the child and wrapped her in a blanket, she looked Clara in the eye and said, "They're gonna write about this, you know." Clara shook her head, half smiling. "They won't believe it. Maybe not, but they'll remember." And they did. 3 days after Clara gave birth, the sky broke. Not in light, not yet, but in a subtle, telling way. Snow that fell less angrily, wind that shrieked less often, a stillness that felt more like exhaustion than threat, like the land itself had fought through the worst of its rage and now sagged with fatigue. The storms didn't stop, but they softened. The cold didn't vanish, but it relented, just a little. Inside the roof-sunk cabin, a kind of order began to form. The visitors, those who had huddled in for warmth, who had knocked on Clara's door with blue fingers and desperate eyes, now moved with a quiet grace, as if they'd lived there for years. They rotated fire duties, took turns tending the pot, wiping the walls of moisture, passing stones from hearth to feet like holy relics. No one raised their voice. No one questioned her. There was a reverence now, not for Clara, but for what the place had become. A boy, Reuben, aged 12, took it upon himself to care for the chimney, crawling to the vent hatch and brushing away snow. A pair of sisters from the Huxley clan wove a rope of dried pine needles and moss to hang near the entry, not for decoration, but because they said the smell reminded them of spring. The man who hadn't spoken in days began humming, a low, tuneless murmur that soothed the children to sleep. The baby, whom Clara named Fern, slept with her most hours of the day, swaddled against her chest, skin pink with health. She barely cried. She didn't need to. She was never too cold, never too hungry, never too alone. Born into a cave of strangers, but never once abandoned. And the roof, her ridiculous roof, never failed them. It hissed in the sun when the rare rays touched it, steamed like a warm beast in the thaw. It creaked, but never cracked. It held weight and melted runoff down its sides like an old thatch hut from some far-off culture no settler here had seen. The angled slopes channeled heat back into the core. The buried edges blocked the drift. The mud-stuffed seams never once let water drip on the child's brow. One man, Jonas Bright, began sketching it with charcoal on a strip of cured hide. Said he wanted to remember. Said he might try it himself come next fall. "Call it a burrow roof," he muttered, chewing on the end of the charcoal stick. "Or a snow skin. Or, hell, just call it Clara's curve." He laughed, but not cruelly. No one did anymore. Even the men who once mocked her now lowered their eyes when passing her cabin. Some lingered outside, not knocking, just watching, as if they wanted to understand but didn't know how to ask, as if they needed to borrow an idea but didn't yet have the humility to request it. Clara didn't mind. They could come when they were ready, but not everyone was ready to accept what had changed. On the 10th day after Fern's birth, the sheriff arrived, Rory Marsh. Not a cruel man, but one bound tight to rules. The type of man who kept a ledger of firewood usage and knew exactly how many rifles each family had registered. He stood outside her door in the early morning, hands gloved, mustache frozen in little white clumps. "I hear you've got 16 people under one roof," he said. Clara nodded. 15 now. The Grahams found space in their cousin's place once it warmed up. "That's still too many for a single hearth?" "It holds." He glanced past her at the low, dark interior. The roofline hung low, barely above his head. The entry tunnel she'd dug let in just enough light to see his breath curl and vanish. "You know there are fire ordinances, and if I followed them, 5 of these people would have frozen before Candlemas." He shifted his weight. "People are talking, Clara. They've been talking since I started building. This is different. They're calling it witchwork. That word hung in the air. Clara didn't flinch. Let them come inside and see. Let them touch the walls. Let them lay beside the fire. It's not witchwork. It's work. That's all. Rory hesitated, then stepped forward. Just once. Just inside. His shoulders stooped as the roof curved down over him. He blinked at the dark, at the slow rise and fall of sleeping bodies tucked along the walls. The fire crackled softly in the middle, no more than a thick log and a bed of orange coals. The air was warm, thick, comforting. He didn't speak. Instead, he removed his gloves, then one boot, then the other. He knelt beside the hearth and extended his hands. He sat like that for a long time. When he left, he said only one thing. If anyone complains, I'll tell them it's just insulation. That made her smile, but it didn't stop the others. One morning, a wooden cross appeared outside her cabin. Not standing, laying flat, rough-hewn, no note, no tracks. Just a message in its own way. The women inside whispered. Mary bit her lip. Bess snorted and muttered, "Fools still think warmth is sin." Clara picked it up, broke it in half, and used it to stoke the fire. A week later, the weather shifted for good. The clouds broke. Sunlight, true gold-touched light, cut through the trees and warmed the upper pines like torches in a cathedral. Snow began to melt, not fast, but steady. And then the thaw began in earnest. Runnels formed, icicles snapped, the creeks groaned and burst loose. One by one, settlers emerged from their cabins, blinking like miners from the dark. They wore furs patched with hide and faces pale with months of indoor sickness. They dragged sleds, checked their stores, began tallying what was left, and everywhere they looked, they saw her roof, bent, buried, enduring. Children played atop it. Chickens huddled along its sunlit edge. The smoke from her fire rose slow and thick, curling like a beacon. By the time March arrived, they no longer called it foolish. They called it a model. Jonas Bright built one like it beside his old cabin. A family from the East Ridge began pulling down their upper walls to lower their slope. Even Fletcher stopped preaching against it. He simply avoided mention of innovations of the flesh and quietly began patching the seams on his own roof with burlap and ash mud. They didn't apologize. They didn't have to. Clara didn't need words. She saw it in their eyes, in how they passed her now, not with scorn, but with a kind of shame, quiet and honest. Some brought her bread, some offered nails. One man left a whole bundle of fresh pine beside her door, wrapped in twine. No note. She kept it all. She gave away what she didn't need, and the baby grew strong. Fern was 6 weeks old when the first daffodil bloomed beside the snowbank near the latrine trench. Clara knelt beside it and stared. Yellow, like a torch, like a warning. Spring was coming, but winter had already taught her everything she needed to know, and her roof, her strange, sloped, scoffed-at roof, had proved every lesson true. Spring came late that year. The rivers stayed crusted with ice well into April, and the mountain pass east of the valley was still frozen solid when the first trading wagon tried to push through. Word trickled in from nearby settlements. Some were worse off, some were gone. A few had lost entire families, cabins gutted by frostbite, pneumonia, starvation. Others fared better, but none without cost. Winter had bitten everyone, but not everyone had survived it the same way. In the Tomlinson cabin, survival hadn't been just endurance. It had been warmth, community, defiance. They had built a world inside those sunken walls that the cold couldn't touch, not just with mud and canvas, but with grit, with kindness, with a kind of stubborn faith that didn't need permission. And now that the thaw had come, the rest of the valley had started to follow. By May, the entire ridge road buzzed with activity. Sleds gave way to wagons. Men chopped lumber again, this time not just for fences or repairs, but for new structures. They stopped Clara at the well now, not to gossip, not to whisper, but to ask. They wanted to know exactly how deep her snowbanks had been packed, what she'd used to seal the inner seams, how she'd fastened her roof slope to the earth without rot. One man even asked for the slope angle in degrees. She told them what she could. The rest, she said, came from feel. It wasn't a plan, she reminded them. It was an answer to cold. It had to fit me, my shape, my fire, my child. They nodded like men hearing scripture for the first time in their own tongue. It wasn't just her cabin anymore. It had become an idea. They called them earth roofs, or slope shrouds, or mud skirts. Some simply said, doing it Clara's way. A few began retrofitting their homes, but others tore their cabins down entirely and started anew. Younger couples asked her to walk the perimeter of their builds, to place her palm against their logs, and tell them what the air felt like. She did, quietly, without fanfare, just a nod, or a shake of the head, or a "you'll lose warmth there," murmured like a prayer. It wasn't fame she wanted. She didn't want a title, or a position, or to be called anything more than what she already was, a mother, and a woman who had outlived the storm. Fern grew fast. The baby laughed early. "Strong lungs," the midwife said. "Born in fire she was," Bess Ryland muttered one day, bouncing the child on her hip. "No wonder she sounds like she's gonna call thunder with her cry." Clara smiled, but deep down she knew it wasn't fire Fern had been born into. It was heat preserved, not blasted, not wasted, kept. That was what had saved them. Not the size of the flame, but the shape of the home. That knowledge became its own quiet revolution. Settlers who had mocked her now hosted gatherings to show off their new designs. Half-dug homes with curved roofs, chimney vents angled like hers, deep snowbanks built intentionally as insulators rather than inconveniences. They passed around mulled cider and pointed proudly to the earth packed tight around their walls, bragging how long the warmth lingered now. At one such gathering, a visiting surveyor from the east overheard a rancher talking about the widow who sealed her roof to the ground and made a hearth out of a hole. The surveyor raised an eyebrow and scribbled something in a small book. He asked for directions to her place, and someone gave them without thinking. He arrived 2 days later, dressed in a heavy wool coat despite the sun. He introduced himself with a stiff bow and a handshake she didn't want. "I'm interested in your methods," he said. "I work with a company that charts frontier innovation." "Innovation?" she repeated, tasting the word. "Yes, practical engineering, design efficiency. We think your structure might offer solutions for colder settlements farther north." She looked past him to where Fern crawled in the grass, fat-cheeked and reaching for a pine cone, then back to him. "It wasn't designed," she said. "It was built, that's all. But the physics, there weren't any. Just wind, cold, and a baby who stopped kicking." He stopped writing. "I see," he said softly. She didn't invite him in. She didn't need to. The roof still stood, sagging like a hibernating beast, now moss-covered and brown with the thaw, with patches of sunlight warming its outer shell like hands over flesh. The inside was cooler now, still sheltered, still dim, but no longer crowded with breath and fear. The guests had all gone, one by one, back to their own corners of the valley. They promised to return in winter. They promised to visit. But Clara knew. Winter changed people. Spring made them forget. She didn't mind. She'd remember enough for all of them. That night she and Fern sat by the fire. Just them again. As it had started. She rocked the child gently, whispering stories that weren't quite true, weren't quite false, tales of wolves who froze at the edge of warm homes, of logs that glowed from within, of rooftops that bent low to kiss the earth and ask for shelter. Stories Fern wouldn't understand yet, but stories Clara needed to say out loud. And as the wind touched the trees outside, not cold anymore, just playful, she whispered the last part into the coals. "They all said it wouldn't work, that I was mad, that a woman alone, expecting, mourning, building, could only fail, that lowering my roof to the dirt was proof I'd lost all sense. But they didn't know. They never knew. A woman on the edge knows things they don't." She looked up at the curve of her roof, now above her like a sheltering hand. This wasn't madness. This was survival shaped like humility. She rocked Fern until her breathing matched the fire's hiss, and outside the roof held its silence. But the land remembered, because when the next winter came, and it did, as winters always do, it wasn't just Clara's roof that touched the earth. It was 30 cabins, then 40, then settlers from across the ridge rode in just to see the buried walls and bent rafters, and tell the story they'd heard secondhand about a pregnant widow who had bent her roof to the ground and kept a baby alive with one log. Clara watched them from her porch. She didn't speak unless asked. She didn't correct their exaggerations. Because what mattered was not whether the story was exactly true. What mattered was that it could be. That someone, somewhere, when the snow came down too fast, and the firewood ran out, and the wind screamed through the gaps in their home, would remember not to build higher, but to bend lower, to shape their walls to the land, to close the gaps, to listen to instinct over advice, to trust warmth not as a luxury, but as a birthright worth fighting for. The child in her arms stirred. She kissed Fern's forehead, warm as any spring morning, and the roof above them, once mocked, now copied, held the heat like it always had, like it always would.